Alrighty, welcome to Nikos RPG. This is Jonathan Albin, and this is Game Master's Guide. Today we're going to be talking about a very deep subject. This will probably take me quite a bit of time, so I hope you can stay with me till the end because there's some really amazing things I want to talk about. But first of all, we're talking about an imagination crisis, and I tried not to use too fiery of lingo here, but the reality is that we are in a situation where creativity is under attack. Now, creativity and imagination have been engines for progress, innovation, and cultural identity for generations. Every major shift in human history, from the Renaissance down to the space age, has been fueled by original thought and bold artistic expression. Yet, despite having more access to knowledge, technology, and creative tools than ever before, the modern world is suffering from a crisis of imagination. Now, before we get into this, make sure you hit all the buttons down below to let the algorithm, let the company, let the world know that you're part of our audience, and also to make sure that you get updated every time there's new videos that come out. But now that we're ready to go, here we go, deep dive. Let's start with the obvious. Hollywood is drowning in sequels, reboots, remakes, redos, rebuilds, etc. The music industry, if you call it an industry any longer, sounds more formulaic than ever. The music that works, they're remaking, and the ones that don't vanish. We don't see any innovations any longer in that area. Even in the publishing industry, it's overrun with copycat novels that are chasing trends, trying to get something going from what's already been done, a regurgitation process, if you will. As the saying goes, don't even get me started on AI. I know that there are those that have issues with the use of it on occasion, but the reality is that the concept of creativity has pretty much been pushed to the side, where repetition has taken precedence over originality. Even the intellectual property laws have been utilized to try to stifle new creative voices rather than foment and promote them. Worst of all, even the audiences themselves have been conditioned to look at things in terms of comfortableness instead of and therefore to look for predictability. Many people now prefer the comfort of a familiar over a challenge of something that might be truly new or innovative or would cause you to question. And it's not just a creative issue, it's cultural, intellectual, and even existential. Our ability to think beyond what is known, to imagine other possible futures, and to push the boundaries of art, knowledge, wisdom are all at stake. Now, in this video, we're going to be looking at 4 primary forces that are undermining this process of human imagination. We're going to be looking at imitation, the endless cycling of ideas disguised as creativity because they call it a new view, and yet it's the same thing rolled over and over. We're going to talk about emulation, the algorithmic enforcement of sameness that has become a driving engine of the way the world works. We're going to talk about the monopolization of intellectual property as the corporations move to stifle anything new and to put a chokehold on those properties that have any innovation or creativity potential. And then finally, we're going to be looking also at mass media and social media and how that has started to condition the audience and to force people to reject originality and look forward to that which is a duplication. Finally, we'll look at a new way to break free from this cycle using something that I call the Imagination Launchpad, and indeed Nikos RPG when we get to that specific. But right now we're going to be looking at the whole of this and try to figure out a tangible means to recover from these dangerous trends in roleplay, in gameplay overall. All right, so we're going to be looking at the collapse of creativity, and we're going to look at it in each of these categories. We're going to start off right at the top with the challenge of imitation, the idea that we are allowing for the illusion of creativity. Imitation has been the default mode for creation in almost every industry in modern times. Rather than take risks on something new, corporations, brands, and even individual creators are copying what has already been successful. I will talk about a few examples in each of the major industries that I want to focus on, but the reality is there are far, far more examples of this than we would be comfortable to talk about anyway. So we're going to start right off the bat with Hollywood. The motion picture industry, television industries have been suffering greatly. As a matter of fact, in 2023, over 50% of Hollywood's top grossing films were sequels, reboots, and adaptations. These replications of things like Fast X, The Little Mermaid, even Indiana Jones are all examples of how they have attempted to sort of cannibalize the creativity of the past and force it into a message-driven monster. Now, we also see this in music. Billboard's top 100 songs have become more harmonically simple over the past 20 years, fundamentally relying on a few familiar chord progressions. As a matter of fact, you may have heard of the four-chord song effect, the idea that you could play four chords and cover the majority of music in modern history. But even streaming platforms like Spotify use recommendation algorithms to push listeners towards similar music, reinforcing these formulaic structures. The record labels are actively seeking out artists who sound like artists that already exist, rather than fostering unique or innovative voices. Now, in the concept of publishing, the bookseller copy machine has become obsessed with trend chasing, so that you can see this in almost identical stories. Consider, for example, the concept of Hunger Games versus Divergent versus The Maze Runner. These are basically cookie cutters of one another. Now, Amazon is flooded with AI-generated novels, which scrape and remix popular themes and put those into shallow, repetitive books to drive revenue with no real innovation. As a matter of fact, the larger organizations that might be able to do something about it, the literary gatekeepers, are ensuring riskier, boundary-pushing authors struggle to be published or even have to publish themselves while they maintain the formulaic books and continue to dominate the marketplace. Now, why does this matter? Well, all these imitation, emulation, and so on feed into a feedback loop where consumers are conditioned to expect familiarity and indeed even crave it. In other words, find out what causes the reader to be fascinated and then do that over and over again to the point where they no longer can see any other alternatives but to keep buying what they're already buying. Now we go to the second of these, the emulation, the algorithmic copy machine. Emulation takes imitation a bit further. It doesn't just copy ideas, but it conditions creators and audiences expect from the certain styles, behaviors, and aesthetics. For example, let's take a look at social media. TikTok and Instagram reward trends. That's all they are about. Copiers who copy other people's videos, styles, sounds, formats, and such to try to gain more visibility actually end up running over one another, while those who innovate truly struggle to get any reach, as typified, for example, by my channel. The idea of what I'm doing is innovative and creative from the standpoint, from the get-go, because the monsters, the machines that have been in effect, are not being addressed in any of this. For example, the mechanism in social media that provides the For You pages effectively pushes you to engage with content that is in the same vein and the same theme and the same flavor as other videos and such that you've already seen, discouraging exploration into areas beyond your framework, but instead trying to find those things that draw you back time and again. As a matter of fact, YouTube, its algorithm prioritizes watch time now over originality, leading to a flood of reaction videos, challenge trends, and regurgitation of old information instead of ground-breaking storytelling. As you may know, there are several of the quote big-time names in the role-playing space that are making the decision to no longer create videos in that context because they have been actively told that the algorithm, that the websites and such are not wanting to carry their information or do not want to support them any further. Additionally, if you look at the concept of the death of animation, there are so many companies that have relegated themselves into obscurity by focusing on AI-driven art and such, that there has been no advancements made in creativity because they're able to pull upon the visual cues of authorized sources in a hodgepodge instead. As a matter of fact, when we talk about AI and creative homogenization, what we're seeing is that the AI-generated art mimics but doesn't innovate. It's impossible for it to innovate because there's not a creative force behind it. It samples and recombines existing works, hoping to find some way to connect those with the desire of the viewer, rather than looking for what is actually new, innovative, and creative. In addition, AI written content has become routine, mundane, flat, and is fundamentally based on older literature, meaning it can't produce anything new. It can only remix the words that it's heard from other sources. Now, why does this matter? Well, creativity thrives on the breakdown of patterns. In other words, a great example is in the concept of humor. The idea of when you want to make a joke, one of the easiest ways to do so is to connect two items that are similar and then add a third that breaks the pattern. But when algorithms try to do this, they force the creators and audience into predictable, engagement-driven loops that just become robotic, and the very concept of imagination atrophies. In dealing with the issue of intellectual property rights and laws, the monopolization of ideas has become paramount because as the major corporations are designed to hold onto their valuables, so to speak, those laws were designed to protect creators, but copyright and patent laws are now being weaponized by corporations to hoard creative ownership and to stifle any possible new voices. For example, we talked recently about the Disney Corporation. Mickey Mouse was supposed to enter public domain back in 1984, but Disney lobbied Congress and extended the copyright protections. In particular for Mickey, they did it twice. Now, this has prevented public storytelling from evolving. You can't go past what has already been. You can only replicate what's allowed, so to speak. Imagine, if you will, if Shakespeare or even modern American folklore had been locked inside those corporate paywalls, we would be still watching videos about Paul Bunyan and such. In addition to that, fan creativity is under attack. There was, for example, a movie that was put together fan-driven for the Star Trek environment, and it was completely shut down. YouTubers, artists, and indie game developers are regularly sued or hit with DMCA strikes for creating transformative fan content. So the people who do try to be innovative and creative are shut down. As a matter of fact, Nintendo, Disney, Warner Brothers, and so on aggressively shut down any fan projects, even when they don't pose any form of commercial threat. Now, this is important to note that because when corporations begin to own pieces of culture, imagination about those cultural items becomes fenced off instead of being allowed to evolve. Another area of this, of course, is media, and the concept of media, whether you're talking about mass media, legacy media, or whether you're talking about the new and social media, one of the biggest reasons creativity is under attack is because isn't just because of corporate control, but it's because the audiences themselves are being conditioned to reject originality. There have been a lot of different conversations about where we get our sources of information, and the rise of comfort content has become a major influence. People are increasingly consuming content from the basis of familiarity, not from novelty. In other words, you look for the people who have produced videos that you liked in the past and you watch that. Social media platforms like TikTok and others train users to expect short, predictable content utilizing similar themes, even similar music, rather than long-form challenging ideas, because the very concept of a long-term presentation can itself be more, I guess you'd say, innovative, because you've got a longer span of time that's being controlled, and therefore this streaming effect encourages passive consumption. The idea of flipping through your phone has become much more potent in terms of views, regardless of how many times they rewatch the same shows, because they want them to be looking at the things they're familiar with rather than exploring new ones. Additionally, and this has actually been the case for quite a long time, the safe bets in film and television is to simply replicate, reboot, sequelize, serialize, because the audience becomes more familiar with their material, and therefore is more likely to pay for something that fits into that streamlined process. Experimental films, new games products, and new venues for watching become they have a difficulty getting funding, while billion-dollar studios continue to push franchise after franchise over the cliff. They literally draw out all of the replicability and creativity and put all their eggs into one basket until that basket breaks, and then they have to go literally search for another place or thing to cannibalize. Now, when the audience itself starts to refuse or turn against originality, there's really no reason for creators to take risks any longer. They should simply fall into line with everyone else, and this is a problem. So now we're going to look at, where's my button? Okay, so now we're going to talk about the very concept of the imitation takeover. And I'm going to give a 50-year timeline for this creativity's decline. Historically, entertainment media, film, music, television, literature, has evolved through cycles of creative booms followed by waves of commercial imitation. That's going all the way back throughout time. There's the Frankenstein movie is out, and all of a sudden everybody makes something about that kind of essence of creative life and such. And so they look for ways to take advantage of that. But over the last 50 years, there's been a dramatic shift where this balance has tipped heavily in favor of repetition over originality, to the point where there are remakes of motion pictures that are literally stripping the original dialogue, discussion, and scenes, replicating them as much as possible while not creating any newness or any innovation. So instead of fostering innovation, these major entertainment industries have now begun to optimize for predictability. They prioritize franchises, trends, risk-averse formulas that guarantee profit but restrict creative progress, because you don't want to run a risk you might break something or be innovative to the point of not gaining any popularity. So let's look at this, how it happened decade by decade across these various venues. We'll start in the 1970s. The 1970s were a transformational era for cinema, It was one of the last times when Hollywood actively took risks on bold, original visions. The irony is that they were actually looking for the replicability that we're talking about, even in those cases. Directors like Francis Ford Coppola with the Godfather series, Martin Scorsese with Taxi Driver, George Lucas with Star Wars, and Spielberg with Jaws, they all ushered in this blockbuster age, but without. But the difference was at that point they were still leaning towards artistic integrity. Even commercial hits were highly experimental in structure and style. Look at the nonlinearity that you see in Godfather Part 2, and look at the mythological building of the worlds of Star Wars. Now, while Jaws and Star Wars were themselves revolutionary films, their commercial success inspired the studios to start chasing those blockbusters instead of embracing the smaller independent films. And since that was driving them towards the market-driven spectacles, they had to play it safe. Now, television was in a period of time that would, by all accounts today, would be considered a golden age for socially and politically challenging television. Things like MASH, All in the Family, The Twilight Zone, both the original and the revival, and a series like Columbo were intelligent, yet unpredictable and willing to tackle controversial themes. This creativity thrived because networks were still willing to take risks. There were, after all, only 3 of them, and the audience weren't yet conditioned to look for formulaic repetition. In the music industry, the birth of punk rock, heavy metal, prog rock, and other styles of music signaled an era of rebellion and genre-breaking sound. You were looking for something that no one had done before, and therefore groups like Pink Floyd, David Bowie, the Ramones, Zeppelin, and Black Sabbath created unpredictable, genre-defining music, but each album was fundamentally a new experiment. There was something new to be tried. Now, as rock music started to become profitable in that period, record labels began to prioritize that music that would be radio-friendly and safe versions even of these genres, leading to the rise of corporate rock and the decline of experimental or innovative music. Now, let's also look at this in the 70s. You also saw literary giants like Kurt Vonnegut, Philip Dick, Toni Morrison, shall we say, Tolkien from an earlier age. Sci-fi and fantasy weren't yet dominated by franchises, so the works like Frank Herbert's Dune and The Left Hand of Darkness were groundbreaking not only in their scope but in their philosophy. As books like Lord of the Rings gained mass popularity, publishers began to focus again on safe routes. So you would see the template starting to form for what is appreciated and understood to be a time-honored and yet easily reproduced mechanism, which led to franchise-driven literature. In the 80s, let's move forward a decade, and now let's start talking about the development of this franchise and formula domination. The sequel booms of the 80s began. How many movies can you think of that have 2, 3, 4, 7 different sequels? Hollywood had realized by this point that sequels, that is, those items that are familiar and highly popular, were going to be more profitable than any new and original films. So the risk takers were the outsiders, the ones who were the major corporations were now duplicating processes. So the 1970s experimentation now leads to a high concept franchise building blockbusters. Think about the motion pictures of the 80s that are most familiar. The Indiana Jones franchise, Terminator, Ghostbusters, even the Die Hard series was now growing in number of episodes. And while these films were still highly creative, the studios began prioritizing long-term IP expansions over the standalone original. They weren't looking for the new Rocketeer. They were looking for what could make the third, fourth, or fifth version of something that had already generated revenue. And the success of Star Wars in particular led to merchandise-driven film. So you create the motion picture, gain some popularity, make some toys, make some lunchboxes and such, and you start driving profitability by focusing the franchises now on toy sales, spin-offs, and brand synergy. How can we link these things together to gain more of this popularity? Television also, if you can think of the 70s into the 80s, there were so many replicants of shows that were familiar. So shows like Cheers, A-Team, Miami Vice were fun, but they were structured and market tested, so you knew if you made another property along those same lines, Charlie's Angels and such like, they became structured, market tested, and therefore proven items that you would replicate, whereas you would take less time to be innovative or creative with the TV programming. As a matter of fact, if a new TV program came out, almost always there'd be 3 or 4 copycats released by other networks or other medium directly on the heels, but that was only to set the stage for the algorithm-driven content production that we have today. In music, for example, the idea of moving from easily identifiable styles of music, MTV transformed music into a highly visual, market-driven product. If you came out with a album or a record, you almost always had to have right on its heels a video. The rise of Michael Jackson, Madonna, and the whole synth pop generation saw the music industry focusing on radio-friendly hits over the value of artistic experimentation. Even those groups who did have a long heritage, if they tried something new, it wouldn't take long for them to be right back on the wagon, so to speak, picking up the properties they had before and replicating those. Even groups like punk rock and heavy metal became more commercialized, losing some of their original rebellion as they moved to try to make crossovers and links to older videos. You can think of a dozen different songs that were replicated in later times that were basically rip-offs of the previous ones, and yet the linking was meant to create the next big hit rather than fostering any form of long-term artistic evolution. You weren't watching what happened as Kiss got older. Kiss was expected to make more songs like they always had before, and were actually poo-pooed when they did do something on the creative side. Now, this was also true in the print industry. The rise of genre franchises led to quite a few major serialized series, whether you're talking about Dragonlance, Wheel of Time, and other storylines, and in particular, even the crossovers like Star Wars suddenly had multiple books coming down in the same formulas, because publishing houses also realized that the long-running series didn't take as much work. If you had a winning set of characters, you could tell story after story without changing the environment and therefore driving people into this replicative viewing and reading and experiencing mechanism. The publishing industry started to value longevity over originality. So authors would be asked to pick up 4, 5, 6, 10 book series because that was what the publishers desired. When you get into the between 1990s and 2000s, now you've gotten the full monetization of this imitation, and I believe that has everything to do with the development of the beginnings of the internet. The idea that you had the death of mid-budget films, and instead you were looking for the hits to keep on hitting, so to speak. So remakes, sequels, adaptations dominated the 2000s. It was very hard to find an innovation film in that period. As a matter of fact, by the late 2000s, Disney and Marvel had perfected the formula into the Infinity series and the concept of building a veritable franchise promoting mechanism. TV had, of course, adapted. Instead of moving so much into as much on the duplication there, they moved to reality TV and more algorithm-driven programming. Networks depended on cheap, predictable programming such as sitcoms, crime shows, and reality TV to make more money than the more expensive and the more experimental shows. So while there was still science fiction on television, those series were also dependent upon legacy. Look at the reinitiation of the Star Trek franchise and the replication and the remakes of all of those. In addition to that, you can look at the inclusion of television programs that took far less special effects to accomplish and were more, therefore, drama driven, and therefore they were more tropic. You could replicate them episode after episode. As a matter of fact, the rise of reality TV trained the audience to prefer predictable, formulaic content. Yes, they're going to make variations on a theme to keep it interesting, but they are going to utilize a model that doesn't take as much work to create. Also look at the development in the music industry of auto-tune, mass market pop, and hit-making algorithms that would actually be able to be almost predictive of which songs would be a good hit and which one are going to be a problem by removing artistic risk-taking and instead putting in mechanisms that would replicate. Streaming services trained audiences to prefer short, catchy, algorithm-friendly songs and to play down the imaginative, creative, and possibly extensive alternative. Now, this is also true when it comes to publishing. Harry Potter led to a wave of young adult themed fantasy clones. The Hunger Games spawned a half dozen dystopian imitators, and Twilight basically predicated a decade of vampire werewolf romance novels that are still popular in modern culture. Now, when you look at today, the algorithms are fundamentally in control of all of this creativity. Hollywood, music, TV, and publishing have now been fully dominated by franchise building, sequels, and market-driven content. There's very little innovation going on. 80% of top grossing films of this decade are sequels and reboots. TV shows are now designed to be binge watched and to have a broader mass appeal to try to get more eyeballs. Music has been optimized in what few pieces are replicated to optimize into TikTok trends and such. And publishing is now dominated by hot trends rather than originality. It's the hot takes. It's the new and happening that must be viewed and reviewed and reviewed. And we are finally in a fully industrialized entertainment area where creativity is optimized for marketability rather than originality. This is why we have to actively defend this portion of industry. Ooh, got behind myself here. Get through all of them. I talked my way through them all. All right. Okay, so now we're going to change gears a little bit and we're going to look at how the education process, both in high schools, colleges, and even in grade school, has actually fueled this imagination versus imitation conflict. While the decline of originality in entertainment is largely driven by corporate profits, algorithmic reinforcement, and audience conditioning, there is another less obvious but equally important force at play, and that is the transformation that education has gone through in the past 50 years. Dramatic changes in educational practices and priorities have been have been playing a crucial role in the suppression of imagination and reinforcing a culture that values imitation over innovation. Some ways that I can give proof of that: you want to look at the very concepts of how things are being taught. It used to be that schools were a place of curiosity, critical thinking, and creative exploration. But with the death of music programs, the death of art programs, even the death of some sports programming, have increasingly forced the others to become more standardized, test-driven environments designed to produce predictable, efficient, measurable, and compliant individuals rather than imaginative thinkers. The very concepts of even medicating children in order to maintain their coherency within their cadre, their cohort, has become absolutely critical. This shift has contributed significantly to the decline of imagination and the rise of imitation-based creative landscapes. The idea, for example, of the way Dungeons and Dragons, we'll come back to this in a bit, but Dungeons and Dragons in particular was an innovative sandbox, if you will, but as time has gone by, the need for that replication capability has driven the property more tightly to its intellectual property framework. And so let's break down how education changed over time so we can see how it has undermined creativity. So in the 1970s, schools encouraged independent thought, exploration, and hands-on learning. There were art, philosophy, music, and storytelling that were core parts of education, and students were often given open-ended assignments to encourage them to form their own interpretations and experiment with ideas. Now, in the 1980s and since, the rise of standardized testing, data-driven education, numerics, the very concept of a rubric. I remember that was one of those terms that when I was a youngster, I had no idea what they meant when they spoke of an educational rubric. But the idea is that the schools prioritize memorization of the facts of time rather than engaging the mind in creative problem solving on how things could have come to the place where they are. Curriculum has become increasingly scripted and mandated by the school systems, taking it out of the hands of the educator and putting it in the hands of administrators to reduce teacher autonomy and to cause the topics to be inside of rigid guidelines. Students are rewarded for finding the right answer now instead of asking new questions. When students learn that there's only one correct way to approach a subject, they become conditioned to only seek predefined answers. In other words, if you look at the mathematical formula and are told, there is only one way to solve this, you are precluding the mind engaging with the what-if questions and what might be beyond that. It also means that they start to seek predefined answers instead of developing their own independent thought. This mindset carries over especially into the arts, which have led to a culture that embraces imitation rather than risk-taking. Now let's compare some of the school assignments that we did when I was in school. The idea of writing original stories, creating free-form essays, answering open-ended questions, which were at the time watchwords for the interview process, which is now completely reversed. But that's dealing with employment. But modern assignments, which are multiple choice tests, standardized prompts, and again that word, strict rubrics, which one do you think is going to foster more creativity? Now, then we see this as time has progressed since the 80s, because now schools have moved away from an emphasis on arts, music, philosophy, and literature, and are completely avoiding subjects that would be abstract thinking, emotional intelligence, and imagination. And instead, they have fundamentally gutted those kind of humanities programs in favor of practical, stoic, straight line subjects like science, technology, engineering, and math. But they're not doing so in a way that still foments creativity or imagination. Instead, they are utilizing processes that teach the student to accept and memorize the things they're talking about. Now, one of the ways you can see this in the most obvious is that they've cut funding for arts, music, drama, literature programs, and instead those have fundamentally been all defunded. And even the very concept of free play and unstructured creativity, the things that were absolutely evident in school, such as the recess programs and things like that, have been drastically reduced. As a matter of fact, they've marginalized philosophy, ethics, and theoretical exploration altogether as being unprofitable for the schools. And the students, therefore, are being pushed towards practical career paths rather than truly imaginative exploration. Even in the universities, your choice of classes is being guided and directed by administrators that have no real interest in the thoughts or the imaginations of their students. Students are therefore not given the tools to think creativity because they're not exposed to those imaginative disciplines we've talked about. When children grow up without storytelling, without music, and without abstract thinking exercises, they therefore become adults who lack the ability to generate truly new ideas. You see this all the time on even in videos on the TikTok channel, where you get to see the duped answers to what would be considered simple enough questions, or even the ones that are correct, requiring imagination to answer, simply can't be answered. And this rise of instant gratification learning shows the influence of the algorithmic processes on education. In the pre-internet era, learning was immersive, often slow in terms of process. The students had to research in books, engage in discussion, learn skills on how to look things up, and struggle through problem solving to find solutions. This built in patience, intellectual stamina, and yes, imaginative, creative problem solving skills. But now, in the modern and the AI era, the rise of Google, Wikipedia, YouTube, and AI powered learning tools has created a culture of instant gratification, low effort research, and students are no longer needing to struggle with complex ideas. They expect an easy, simple, short answer so they don't have to do any of the digestion of the knowledge themselves. They want the ability to sit, they have lost the ability to sit with difficult questions and explore multiple solutions. And AI-generated essays, prepackaged knowledge, rampant cheating in the educational system have led to people not being able to innovate or create new answers, but instead to only copy, remix, and regurgitate existing information. Now, they compare this process, for example, even a simple one, they took away handwriting. They moved from needing people to be able to write in cursive and have replaced that with adding multiple library resources, teaching the kids fundamentally how to do copy pasting, and therefore the answers are becoming more AI generated and less innovative, and obviously it no longer builds intellectual resilience among the students. Instead, it builds copycats and consumers. In addition to that, we now have moved away from the idea of facing our fears and becoming risk averse. The death of intellectual play started long ago. During the pre-1990s, students were still encouraged to take risks in their work. Failure was seen as a natural part of growth. If you wanted to get good grades, you expect to get a bad grade and then fix it. And particular tools such as socialized play, experimentation, and curiosity back then were absolutely central to learning, and those have all but eliminated in modern education because of the fact that there are now considerably high stakes put on an educational program in terms of producing numeric results. The high stakes testing and grade obsession has made failure unacceptable. A student simply cannot have a grade of less than optimal because they are therefore judged by that rather than seeing it as a stepping stone of advancement. Creativity is often penalized in structured grading systems. You can't create imaginative answers. You can't be clever. You have to follow standard expected formulas rather than even involve yourself in experimentation. The social pressure, and especially with cancel culture and corporate conformity, has therefore discouraged any bold, new, innovative ideas in education. Because creativity, by its own nature, requires risk, but modern education systems condition the students to fear making mistakes. This leads to a generation that prioritizes safe, predictable choices over anything that might be an innovation. Now imagine if the greatest historic thinkers, Da Vinci, Einstein, Picasso, had been raised in such a risk-averse, grade-obsessed system. Would they be more creative or less creative, do you think? Now, the education system has been directly contributing to the decline of creative industries by conditioning students to think in predictable patterns, fear any experimentation, seek instant answers, and quelch any individual who is creative on the basis of that being too obtuse, too easily a diversion rather than a real advance. But there's more to it than that, and I'm going to talk a bit about a specific philosophy that I believe feeds into this, and that's the concept of postmodernism. It's a cult of anti-truth, and the death of imagination stems directly from it. Now, postmodernism was not a natural evolution of thought, but rather a reactionary, parasitic philosophy, a contrarian rejection of all tradition, structure, meaning, and truth without providing any coherent alternative. It was not that they were saying the ideas of the past should be revisited on the basis of something new and innovative that might cause you to reconsider, but instead it was a discounting or a disclaimer against all other creative thought processes because it simply eliminated them. Unlike other philosophical movements that encourage new ideas, new frameworks for understanding reality, such as Enlightenment, rationalism, Romanticism, or even existentialism, postmodernism proposes nothing except skepticism, irony, and endless deconstruction. Now, this isn't intellectual progress. This is cultural entropy. Now, let's talk about these in particular. All right, there we go. Catch back up. I don't want to be so far behind next time. So the first thing is to acknowledge that postmodernism is a purely negative force. Unlike previous intellectual movements that had sought to add to human knowledge, postmodernism is literally just a negation. It exists only to tear down, fragment, and reduce open thought to the point of inadequacy. It's a deconstruction process without reconstruction because it thrives on dismantling beliefs, institutions, art forms, and historical narratives, but it doesn't actually offer a replacement for any of them. Instead, it depends on the participant to say that nothing's real, everything's subjective, meaning itself has no meaning. This leads to a permanent state of cultural exhaustion, because there is no place to go to, no process by which we can avoid this disillusionment. Let me give you an example. Shakespeare, Homer, Tolkien either created new myths and archetypes and cultural structures or redefined them in order to explain the progress in those stories. Derrida, Foucault, and Baudrillard didn't. Instead, they simply mocked, questioned, and rejected meaning itself while offering nothing in return other than that emptiness. And the key problem is that a society that only deconstructs will eventually have nothing left to deconstruct. So this assault on absolute truth and meaning argues that truth is subjective, reality is a construct, and meaning is arbitrary. The entire conflict that has arisen about gender or identity or whatever, all stems from this concept. It's not just philosophically incoherent, it's culturally corrosive. If you haven't seen that in the last 5 to 10 years, you've probably been not paying attention. But if nothing is true, then nothing matters. So why create if art itself is just a self-referential illusion and has no value? If everything is subjective, then genius and mediocrity are indistinguishable. You cannot tell that a work of art like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel has any greater value, for instance, than a child's doodle. And by that kind of an equation, you are therefore undermining the value of all things that came before. And if meaning is arbitrary, then there's no purpose for striving for greatness, no reason to look for a new interpretation when all of them are equally invalid. Now, this is how postmodernism actively discourages imagination, because it replaces the pursuit of truth, transcendence, and meaning with this dangerous self-awareness of nihilism and irony. We are where we are because we've allowed fundamentally a non-answer to be the only answer that's accepted. Postmodernism's anti-truth agenda destroys every foundation upon which creativity thrives. There is no longer, therefore, a belief that some ideas are better than others, some might be more profound or more true. Now, postmodernism's anti-truth, anti-structure, and anti-meaning philosophy has led directly to the cultural stagnation that we're seeing today, where art, music, film, literatures are trapped in cycles of irony, pastiche, and unoriginal self-reference. That's all they have left. This has led to a death of sincerity and the rise of meta-irony, what in many role-play games is the metaverse, and we see this not only in role-playing games, but we also see it in trading card games, where the meta conversation about what works is more valued because it's simply a way of deconstructing what someone else has built. So, for example, if we look at in the past, works like Lord of the Rings embraced mythic sincerity, timeless themes, and moral stakes of great value to the persons in the story. But now, Marvel films, and in particular Deadpool, they now rely on meta jokes, self-aware irony, and fourth wall breaking in order to mock their own existence, to undermine the very framework of believability that the stories would have otherwise. And when a story winks at its own audience, they lose the emotional depth and sincerity that the original might have had. This is true whether you're talking about motion pictures or the music industry. It used to be that groups like Beatles, Led Zeppelin, and Pink Floyd would push musical boundaries, experimenting with new sounds, new forms of music, and new styles of storytelling. But now the Billboard charts are dominated by auto-tuned, loop-based productions, algorithm-driven songwriting that follows an absolute formula, to the detriment of the very art form and a self-deprecation of the artists. So when music becomes self-referential and ironic, it ceases to elevate, innovate, or raise up the spirit of the hearer. And this is also true in the writing format. When we talk about literary works, postmodernism rejects grand narrative. The concept, even in role-play games, of going from the grand story arc world building of a game master and relegating it down below the value of the single shot one-time thing. You actually are rejecting those grand narratives and instead are focusing on metafiction, self-awareness, and genre subversion. For example, in video, again, going back to role-play games for a moment, the very idea of building a persona's backstory is now perceived in many cases to be of more value than the very idea of the story itself being developed and the character's advancement along that path. Now, a society that can only mock its own stories can't create new ones. the very idea of myth and legend are going to be undermined over time as the consumers sit and chop and channel them through their choice of what videos they want to watch. So now we're going to talk about the conclusion. How do we fight for imagination in the future? The world is radically training us to embrace sameness and reject risk. Do what is safe, do what is familiar, and don't ask too many questions. If we allow that, we're losing something that is irreplaceable, and that is our human imagination. Now, if this was resonating with you, let's start this conversation. How can we push creativity forward in an area of such repetition? Well, here we go. First thing we have to do is find a way to escape this death cycle. Before we can create bold, innovative, and original works, we have to undo the conditioning that has locked us into these pre-existing structures. If you've looked at role-playing games through only the lens of Dungeons and Dragons, then you have only got a very narrow framework on which to build even the new creations you might want to do, and they are now also limited because you are superimposing upon your own creativity the limits and boundaries set there by someone who isn't you. This means we have to deprogram that. That means we have to become conscious of the forces that are shaping our thinking and try to reject them actively while pursuing those angles that will give us back our own creativity. So we have to deconstruct. Well, how do we get to the point of deconstruction? We have to therefore define what it is that we're involved with that's happening that needs to be deprogrammed. First of all, we have to ask ourselves, what are we consuming? Why are we consuming it? What are we watching, reading, or listening to that is now a habit? And how much of that is actually because we generally are inspired by it? I hazard a guess that it's probably not very much. We also need to break away from mainstream or algorithm-driven content and seek out the experimental, the underground, and the overlooked. One of the ways is through, ironically, search engines. But when you do that, ironically, you are still feeding the beast because now you are giving the engine, the audience, your attention, and therefore undermining your own ability to gain creativity. So that means we also need to deconstruct the pattern. We have to find ways to interrupt the very algorithmic process of reading what we're thinking. We have to challenge ourselves to consume content that maybe the algorithm wouldn't recommend to us. We need to search for independent films, new creative processes, new game mechanisms that are outside of the purview of such a thing. For example, if we look at Dungeons and Dragons as their franchise continues to become more and more solidified behind the paywall, so to speak, of their intellectual property, we need to find new ways of seeking out independent film, experimental music, underground art, and game systems that are outside of the bestsellers list. We need to train the algorithm to serve us rather than the other way around. So when we do innovative or creative searches, make sure that we look at a wide array of the possibilities so that there's no longer a pigeonholing of that which we are interested in. Now we need to also resist nostalgia bait. One of the things that when I was starting to create Nikos RPG, I was really wanting to stay away from are those mechanisms that felt like or seemed to fall directly in the framework of the larger company, because that fundamentally allows your companies, the companies that you buy from, to sell your childhood over and over again. Don't stick to predictive patterns, but look for other things that might appeal to you. I've spent the last few months, for example, watching a lot of alternative videos in the same genre of those films that I appreciate, but I'm not sitting and watching only the reboots, reconnections, and sequels and such. We also need to promote and prioritize creative play over rank consumption. In other words, if you haven't yet consider not just consuming content, but actually making content. Yes, my viewership is not optimal. I'm not as big as I would like to be, but it takes time for these things to happen. And creativity isn't about the perfection of it, it's about the curiosity and exploration. One of the reasons why I'm making this longer tail video is because there is more to the world than just the short form. And we need to therefore be able to build and create without a worry for the audience, because if what we do has value to the consumer, they will find us. And one of the things I will ask at this point, obvious plug, make sure that you subscribe to this channel, and more importantly, share this video with someone else so we can get the word out on this entire danger that we have with the failure of imagination in this country. And do this not because you're looking for an audience, but because you are looking for that material to be made available for others. Because deprogramming, deconnecting from this requires control of your independent creative inputs. Because the quality of what you create will depend upon the quality of that which you absorb. If you only take in the repetitive, replicable materials of others, then all you will do is become another repetitive and a predictable resource for this machine. So the next thing we have to look at is this actual breaking of the pattern. And once you've deprogrammed yourself from this thinking and are moving towards an active deconstruction, begin to break apart existing creative formulas to understand how they work and to reconstruct them in new ways. The reason why a innovative storyteller or game master's show or episodes have appeal is because they are not the norm, they are not patternistic, and therefore we can actually take them apart and analyze how they are created, how music is composed, how visual styles emerge, and then subvert those structures to produce something new. Now, does that mean that there is nothing new and that everything is innovative? No. What I'm saying instead is that we analyze the invisible patterns, we find a way to establish what is familiar about them, and then dissect it. Try to figure out what triggers are in that property that make players want to be a part of it. Flip the expected narrative. So change the direction of your course. And say if all of the adventures you've ever played in have been hero's journey, perhaps you play a story that is of mundane simplicity, a person that stays in their local area and stays within their lane. This mechanism can actually change up the play of it. Same with looking to listen to the music you've listened to, but listen in a different scale with a different recording artist. And then even when you're looking at the stories that you read, consider how they might have been told otherwise, because these ideas, these concepts of what might be different are really the keys to our own progression of that which is of interest or creative for us. Finally, mash up unrelated ideas. The idea of taking a cyberpunk and an ancient myth and merging them together is one thing, but what about performing jazz music on heavy metal instruments? Basically, break the genres, bend the rules, and disrupt traditions. Now, we're going to be coming up in a second on how the Nikos RPG actually gives you a disruption tool, but we're not quite there yet. So let's talk a little bit more about the constraints of using the constraints that are already built in as instead a creative tool. Well, artificial limits force new solutions. So instead of looking up one kind of prop, maybe look up 3 or 4. Look at a novel without using any particular adjectives, maybe a painting in only a couple of colors. These restrictions create disruptions, and constraints disrupt default thinking, therefore leading to truly original concepts. Okay, so now we're going to be talking about the imitation loop in role-playing games. To give an example, it's an industry of which I know a lot. I've been a game master for as long as this particular category has existed. 50 years, 5 decades I've been a storyteller, and tabletop RPGs generally have had a consistent replicable pattern to them. And that's because of the following things. In the 1970s through the 1990s, the Dungeons and Dragons model took hold. The mechanical DNA of all role-play games that are out there with one possible exception, / Nikos RPG. They become the unspoken standard for the entire industry. That includes the electronic format of RPGs. A class-based, level-progressed, hit points based with a D20 dice mechanism were repeated endlessly. Yes, there were some diversions in how they were interpreted, which were perceived at the time to be refreshing, but ultimately they all fall into the same traps. New RPGs in the 80s and 90s actually were refining the D&D model rather than breaking out of it. They were looking for ways to streamline or make the system even easier to acquire. Then phase 2, starting in the 2000s, the open game license allowed third-party developers to create D&D content, which therefore also fomented and promoted reinforcement of all of those mechanical tropes rather than investing and inventing new ones. Companies optimized their RPG designs for brand identification and accessibility rather than for innovation and revenge or rival cultures. Instead, it meant that you offered slight variations rather than true invention because you weren't actually getting rid of the original mechanism. The industry itself became risk averse as the major corporation fell into the hands of a larger conglomerate who really can't risk dangers to their property, leading to franchise-driven games such as the Star Wars game, the Witcher game, Marvel games. These are all set up so that they are not going to risk connection with the larger titles and instead are going to help propagate that cookie cutter process that's already been there. Then finally, phase 3, current cultural conditioning and perceptual lock-in has become self-sustaining. Players are now expecting certain mechanics and structures because that's all they've ever known. When I introduce somebody who has played role-play games before to the Nikos RPG system, it does take some regrowth of imaginative tissue, so to speak, to be able to move beyond those boundaries because the game designers of our recent past have followed the formulas rather than pushing any new boundaries because they didn't want to fear. They wanted to avoid anything experimental that might alienate players. Since Nikos RPG doesn't have those aspersions, we're good to go. The rise of rules-light narrative games that don't break the cycle is just repackaging. For example, Lit RPG, I was doing some research on that recently, and I was kind of surprised to see that they are not innovating, but instead replicating the other processes, making the actual rules now canon and therefore familiarizing themselves to role-play structures that are beyond them so that even if they do try to advance, they're going to run into the cookie cutter and find that that is the only direction they can go. So the final verdict is that the industry has not seen a fundamental shift in RPG structure since 1974, just variations, tweaks, and adaptations. So now the question becomes, how does Nikos RPG break this imitation loop? So first of all, those of you that are not aware, Nikos RPG is a game system devised by myself over the last 10 years, but I've got 50 years of experience in the business, so I've been aware of the challenges and have only in the last 2 or 3 years been able to clarify and codify the means to break this mechanism. And the first one, break free of the class boundaries. Dungeons and Dragons, because of its formulaic approach, and as I've said before, its World War II legacy, the Nikos RPG actively disrupts that by providing the players the opportunity to pursue any pathway in terms of career options as they want, instead of utilizing static character classes that limit their progression. And this open-ended flexible character building mechanic allows that to evolve dynamically session after session with the players not locked into stereotypes, but instead being able to grow organically based on their story progression driven by them as the players rather than the rigid level ups demanded by an external class mechanism. Next thing, removes the dice heavy number crunching mentality. The original
Dungeons and Dragons utilized all 7 of the polyhedral sides and figured out the ways to get people to stay within their lane. But by getting rid of these number crunching mentalities and going to a percentage based system that's intuitive, you end up having a much more fluid, moment to moment decision making process, allowing imagination to take the driver's seat compared to statistical optimization, which is now rampant in the role-play environment as it stands generally. That also deprioritizes the linear power progression because it does not promote giving awards for, say, for example, combat over other forms of experience. You're not required to even earn any experience points, but instead may advance your persona session over session simply by utilizing the skills that you're wishing to develop and advancing them on your own. That allows for the player to have much more agency in the advancement of their character's procession, and instead of waiting for the DM's permission, they can build their own course of advance. It also rejects the very idea of linear progression altogether by giving it a much more immersive and skill-driven approach. Now, the trick here is that players can unlearn the correct way to play D&D, and by thinking more creative about their character and their narrative evolution in a system that does not bind them to it. Hence, Nikos RPG is a better way to go. Next is we want to talk about how we can break down industry structures. Now, Nikos RPG doesn't just tweak the mechanics of the game, it actually dismantles RPG formula and rebuilds with a new radical procedure. And that is, we're going to invent a new perception of player versus non-player. We're going to work on the concept of injunction to allow the players to have a break when they need to within a game system and not lose their character's continuity. It offers a growth-based experience for the players based on the storytelling and the players' feedback in terms of their actions and their decisions when they have actually made successes, to not dictate by an experience point chart, but by actually taking into account the in-game activities and decisions that they make. World building, even in this case, is an active player-driven system, whereas in other systems where you have to continually research what is appropriate or what is allowed within a world system, Nikos RPG allows the personas, whether they be players or directors, to actually grow their story in a storytelling method, utilizing the basics of percentage dice to codify things, but then therefore allowing the players to then redefine the world dynamically, meaning that it's never static, but is constantly in flux on all variables. Even the adventure itself can gain over time. It also means that the game adapts to the players rather than the players adapting to the game. Since the percentage system doesn't require memorization of rule books, but only to use the books as a resource, Nikos RPG responds to player creativity dynamically, making every game at everybody's table unique, which gives the storyteller, game master, so much more innovative and imaginative directions they could take their stories. Nikos breaks the mechanical rigidity of a standard role-playing game, forcing a shift of the player's expectations towards true agency on their part. The next piece is to actually activate imagination. And Nikos RPG goes beyond breaking the imagination cycle, the imitation cycle we've talked about, but it creates an RPG system that resists reabsorption into the standardized process. Nikos RPG, when you look at the property, does not have the standard hallmarks of a, quote, modern new RPG. I did not, for example, utilize any world lore other than tangential ones to build the story of the game. Instead, I want you as the new game master, the new creator, to build the story you want to go. It's going to be a living game world instead of a static pile of lore that you must memorize. The traditional games generally rely on pre-written lore. It doesn't evolve. If you run the same material more than once, you don't have any place else to go with it. But Nikos RPG builds its lore in real time, meaning that no two settings, even if two game masters are running the same genre, are not going to be identical ever. And this new narrative mechanic means that the system can't be reduced to simple rules that can be all or nothing. As a matter of fact, it's not reducible to a gameplay loop. It forces unique, emergent storytelling rather than repetitive mission structures. This makes every Nikos RPG session, saga, or series a fundamentally new experience, a system that cannot be easily copied or commodified. It certainly can be utilized almost like a saddle for systems that are already in place, so that you can break yourself free by literally taking the parts you want to modify and changing them until such time as the entirety has been extracted. It's not, for example, like the D20 system that's been copied by countless other genres or other game systems. This is a standalone that is on its own. And ironically, it's also built fundamentally by one person. The Nikos RPG approach to character development, world building, and narrative agency is too organic to be broken down into a replicable mechanic. So it's not just another RPG system. It redefines how TTRPGs as a whole function, making it impossible to plug into existing corporate imitation cycle for regurgitation and eventual corruption. The Nikos RPG is the true evolution of role-play games industry. It directly applies to the Imagination Launchpad process, which is available in my book, The Way of the Game, and there's more available for that at my website, nikosrpg.com. And it doesn't challenge just the RPG norms. It now creates a model of play that is unrepeatable. And now we get to go to the fun part. You can go right now to nikosrpg.com, go to the Ready to Play section, and download for yourself the 11-page fast play rule system. It's a very small portion of the master book, and therefore you'll have what you need to get a handle on how the game mechanic works. I'd love to get your feedback, so please, if you can, go over to nikosrpg.com and download the fast play. Give me your interpretation or your impact on it. More importantly, I want to hear how you would utilize it. Now, full disclosure, we have just put into availability a pre-release version of the entirety of the Nikos RPG system with all of the properties that are now available under that brand title. So there's one master book that covers the generics of role-playing in any environment, and then there are 6 genre books: Dark Shards, Downshift, Distant Suns, Dawn Soldier, Deep State, and Dread Signs, all available right now at the website. I'll put a link in the comments in the description below. But do what you can to get this word out to people. Like, share, get this in the hands of as many people as you can. Repost it where necessary. Let's get everyone thinking about what we can do to recapture and reinvigorate the imaginative nature of our world. And to do so, let's start with the simple things like playing Nikos RPG. Alrighty, I have gone a little bit over what I wanted to in terms of time. I wanted to make it to an hour, but I went to an hour and a half. So I want to thank you again for being here. If you're watching and you have not yet subscribed, make sure you do so. If you are on Twitch, just so you know, if you subscribe to the Twitch channel, you get to see all of my episodes with no commercials. So that's a really handy way of looking at it. If you are on YouTube and you subscribe, just know that I greatly appreciate it, and you're going to help us get this word out about the optimal replacement for the mechanistically imitative role-play games that are out there now. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been Nikos RPG. You have a great night.